Sound, music, sustainability. Welcome to Sustain FM. In many ways, music is all about relationships. Relationships between musicians, between artists and audiences, between artists and their instruments, even the relationships between sounds and notes in a scale. But we can also think of these relationships inside a wider web of connections. What would it be like to compose and perform music that embeds relationships between humans and non-humans, such as plants, animals, or environments? What that might do to how we compose, perform, and listen to music. Today we dive into these questions with Luis Fernando Amaya, a composer and percussionist based in Oslo. Born in Aguascalientes, Mexico, Luis Fernando studied composition and music theory at the Centro de Investigación y Estudios Musicales, and I apologize for my Spanish pronunciation, and holds a PhD in composition and music technology from Northwestern University. Luis Fernando's music has been performed throughout the Americas and Europe, and themes of collective memory and relationships between humans and non-humans are often present in his work. Very happy to have a chance to chat with Luis Fernando and actually chat in person for a change. Usually those are over Zoom. So welcome, Luis Fernando.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Yeah, I'm excited to actually be here in person. And actually speaking of being here in person, so I see from your bio that you've moved around a lot from Mexico to Chicago to Puerto Rico to Spain and now in Norway. So I'm curious how that path has affected the way you think about sound and music and composition.
Well, it's a great question, and I think it's something that I keep discovering, kind of like with a big delay. Mm-hmm. I notice that definitely my surroundings, in many ways, of course, the sounds, but also kind of like the kind of life that I have in the place that I'm in, really affects what I do and how I think of the world, and therefore the music that I make. Mm-hmm. But I've realized that every time I have moved, there's something that gets really stuck in my brain from the previous place or places. And they're not always linear.
Okay.
But I realize that places, or like not necessarily places only, but places and the feelings attached to them, or like a sense of place, are really important in the way that I go around in life. I'm going to give you an example. When I moved to Spain first, or to Catalonia, depends on how you see it, I moved to Barcelona, and I remember that I had these weird like flashes of places in Aguascalientes, in my home city. From really weird perspectives, kind of like from 6 meters above the ground, very sudden flashes of places with some sort of sound that relates to the place. Absolutely random, very vivid though. And these kinds of things that happen to me, they usually just occur when I don't live in the place anymore.
Right.
It's kind of like a weird flashback appreciation of certain things, of the places that I was in. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question necessarily in a musical perspective, but I think that, especially the way that I think of music, which tends to be maybe not so musical, but more sonic in a way, or environmental, or experiential. Like what I want to create is like these sonic experiences that they do have a beginning and an end, so they're pieces of music, but I don't necessarily always think of them in that way. And I think that all of these things really affect the way that I compose, usually.
Okay, I think it does answer the question in a way, because the next thing I wanted to ask about was relationships. And as we talked about in the intro, that could be relationship between people, but of course there's also relationships to place, which, as I say, are not necessarily obvious at the time. So I want to ask more about that in a little bit, but before we get into that sort of broader human, non-human relationships, you mentioned just a couple minutes ago around how you were thinking about sound and sort of sonic experiences. But I'm also interested in your relationships in terms of composition and performance stage. So how do you think about yourself as a relationships between you and as a composer and the musicians performing your work, or the work that you perform solo, or your relationship to audiences and instruments? Because all of those are different kinds of relationships, but you're actually, I think, not uniquely, but a lot of artists are one thing. They're a composer, or they're a musician, or they're a film score, or they're a whatever. But you actually cross over some of those things a little bit. I'm curious about how you think about the relationship between those different parts of what you actually do.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you said it very well that my work is mostly concerned about relationships in different ways. And of course, I make a lot of emphasis in how I explore these relationships with non-human others, between humans and non-human others, or particularly between me and these either beings or objects or ideas. But it is true that I don't talk so much about the way that I relate with the musicians or with the music. I really love the discovery process, the musical discovery process, and I really enjoy sharing that. So that's why my favorite way of working usually is with close collaboration. I do work in other ways, but it's never the same. And also, I really like how this shared process establishes a certain kind of relationship between the people who are working. They usually become friends. If they don't become friends, at least we have a good relationship and good experiences that that we cherish usually. I'm going to talk for myself, but usually I hear the same from the other part. But also there's this element of you say, like, my relationship with my different kind of like hats, to put it in a way. Yeah. And I actually never thought about it as different. It's funny, like, I mean, I do call myself like a composer and percussionist, but actually I don't play that much percussion longer because I play a lot of other things. Right. And I play a lot of live electronics and jarana, which is a Mexican instrument that is similar to the Baroque guitar, and I sing. And I guess to me, I see everything kind of like in the same soup, and it's just moving around. And because the edges are very unclear between them, I don't think that much about that. Even though some of the styles are very different, from like very experimental stuff to very traditional music, but at the same time, I feel like those two are super connected. So I guess I would have to think more about, or maybe that's my answer. I see this as a relationship with one thing that it's moving more than
right. Rather than several discrete things. Yeah. Okay. I mean, that makes sense. It's I think it's interesting because I think as we'll talk about it a little bit more, I can kind of see how that sort of flows into the type of work that you produce as well. And I'm going to apologize in advance for my pronunciation again here. So your last album, Corto Hojas? Okay, thank you. And I'm just going to quote here from the actual album text, was described as an invitation to a different way of listening to Earth, perhaps one which is processed through a lens that has little to do with Homo sapiens. So I'm curious, what does a different way of listening mean to you?
Well, that text was written by the producer of the album, Luis Fernando Amaya, from Protomaterial Records. And I've also wondered that, actually. I never asked him, but I do think that, I mean, we talk a lot about, he's also a composer. We studied Northwestern together, and we have spoken a lot about these things. And I think that I feel very appreciated with him in some ways. I feel like he really sees some of my interests. And one thing that he has told me several times is that he thinks that I have a very personal approach to this, which I of course appreciate. And maybe what he means is that personal approach to him is like a new way of listening to Earth, or maybe what we can call Earth, everything in it, everything and everyone. I definitely I mean, I definitely don't think about a new way of listening, but that's not completely true. I do try to, in a way, listen to the impossible in my head and then reproduce it with my music.
Okay.
For example, I try to imagine how a vegetal language would sound like to human ears, and from this language, its variations, how would they change, and why also, or these pieces that I compose with imaginary animals, and or for example, my doctoral dissertation piece is, which unfortunately was never premiered yet because of COVID, but it's a 1 hour piece. It's about the life, 1 year in the life of a tree, but from the tree's perspective. So we're hearing kind of like what the tree hears, which is a mix between the environment and itself.
Right.
So this kind of like stretch to listen to the inaudible, or it might be that.
Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. And yeah, listening to what the tree hears, I always find that fascinating. Certainly working with infrasonic or ultrasonic sounds, like the sounds of bat calls or dolphin calls, or sounds of earthquakes and so on, where we can translate those, and we can slow down those ultrasonic recordings in a human range. We can speed up the infrasonic, so we're kind of quote unquote hearing the sounds of the bat calls. We're hearing the sounds of the dolphins, but we're actually we're hearing a translated version of that into our human range. So it's fascinating to think about what they're hearing from that perspective too.
Yeah, I like that, and also, I mean, precisely because we will never be able to listen to anything that is not a translation or a representation. I think the psychological element of that experiment is the most valuable part of being, okay, I know that this is something that I cannot do, but I am going to engage in this so deeply that the experience feels as meaningful as, like, that it is transformative in a way. And that's something that I really look for, that these things transform the way that I listen or relate to or I observe. Also, a lot of research is involved, for example, about the way that plants experience the world. They have so many senses that we don't, and they perceive everything that we can perceive, you know, sounds, smells, light, but in such different ways. Right? And that it's, in many ways, this always makes me, is a very humbling experience in a way. Like, okay, you really can experience things that I can't, and I don't know.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah, that's amazing. So that kind of, maybe barrier is the wrong word, but you mentioned it a little while ago. But yeah, listening to the impossible, hearing the impossible. That's great. So maybe on that thread. So one of the tracks there on that album. Gorilla de dientes entre, I keep pronouncing this with a French pronunciation instead of a Spanish pronunciation, entre las arbores.
I can pronounce it if you want.
Please.
The title is Guerrilla de dientes entre los árboles.
Perfect.
And it translates into guerrilla of teeth amongst the trees.
Okay, perfect. So that's also connected to relationships and travel that you talked about earlier. So I'm curious, how did you get from insects to gorillas? And is that connected to the hearing the impossible that we were just talking about?
Well, actually, yes. Although in this case, it's more like extending what I like. It's like more about the memory of a sound and trying to reach to it, or trying to reach to the beings that produced it a while ago. So my experience comes from when I was living in Mexico City. I heard for the first time, maybe, because of the place that I was in, we had like a ceramic tiles, and there was this very big insect. I think in English it's called potato bug.
Okay.
Or in Spanish has a very ominous name, which is cara de niño, like child face. And before I saw it, I heard it walk. Something that hadn't really happened to me before, even though my whole childhood was full of insects, insects that are disappearing super fast now. And this experience of that, listening to that potato bug and everything that I felt and thought about and how I related to it, and It was just basically I put it in a Tupperware and let it out. But that sound kind of like stayed not only in my ears but in my body for a long time. I think about it and I feel it in a way.
Right.
And so and then when I was writing this piece, I was living in Puerto Rico, which still has quite a few insects, unlike, for example, most like Chicago in the U.S. or mostly anywhere in Europe, probably. And I would think of these like kind of like insects as not necessarily having teeth, but all of them being teeth. You know, this kind of like exoskeleton and how it interacts with the world and the sounds that it makes, and maybe even the feeling that they would have as while touching things. I thought it was very interesting and beautiful and strange. And I read this text from a friend who's a poet from Venezuela called Pedro Varguillas. And actually, the text is kind of sexual in many ways. Like maybe sexual is like erotic, but I just love this thing. I was talking about a gorilla of teeth amongst the trees because I immediately thought of insects and how they are, and kind of like this relationship with them between humans and insects that is kind of complex. You know, we completely depend on insects, but we see them sometimes as completely undesirable.
Right.
So it's about all of that.
Okay. Amazing. Okay, let's take a listen to that. So that's fascinating, and it connects back to, I mean, the threads that we've been talking about so far around your work being connected to and the relationships with the non-human world. And I'm curious maybe to talk a little bit about what some of the methods you're using. And by that I mean, you've talked about hearing the sound of the impossible and translating that. You talked about that vegetal language. You've talked about some of those kind of things. And I'm curious, are you sort of capturing and manipulating field recordings or processing the sensor data? Or is it more about actually using those non-human sounds and ways of being as inspiration, sort of like what you were just talking about? Or is it all of the above? I'm kind of curious how you're doing that. Even with what you're talking about with that, the dissertation project of the tree, because I can imagine different ways you could technically implement that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I almost never use field recordings or sounds of animals or etc. But I do use them, but like through my memory.
Right.
A lot. I feel like memory has this very beautiful and sometimes problematic quality of just processing things so much, and most of the things that we remember, they are us. You know, they're like a reflection of us in many ways, and that's kind of like what I take advantage of. I remember things, and then I work with them, and then it's really cool to go back to the actual sounds that inspired them and realize that they were very different. That my memory and my associations had completely changed the way that I was experiencing them in my head. And I also work a lot with these kind of like psychological exercises of, you know, trying to listen to these things by means of observation mostly.
Do you mean yourself doing that, or audiences doing that, or both? Or?
Me.
You, okay.
So for example, this series of works called Tree Dialects, Dialectos de Árbol, I started the series by observing trees, how they move, and just being like, okay, if this could be a sonic experience, and this being, if I could listen to this being, not things that happen to it, but it,
right?
What would it be like? Or these kinds of things, like things that I read, for example. I'm very fond of literature in general, and I find like especially things that evoke sound really really inspiring. So this is something I work with. I do work a lot with like some of the psychological exercises. I do them with the performers that I work with, especially in this cycle called Bestiario, the one that I mentioned briefly about the imaginary animals.
Right.
And like we try to produce sounds that if we heard them without seeing what's happening, we could imagine that they come from an organic body.
Right. Okay.
And then this I do record and manipulate, and I use a lot in the electronics, and I listen to it extensively.
Right.
But usually from the sources, I try not to use it.
Okay. So let's follow that thread a little bit. So you just mentioned that new album, and there's a new single out now already. And so one of the things I find very interesting is so you're talking about the imaginary animals, and you're talking about sort of listening and memory. And one of the other things about this piece was that the performers were instructed to personify a fictional animal through sound, which you've talked about a little bit. But what I find really interesting, and this is a quote from the liner notes. Can you say liner notes anymore if it's digital? But anyway,
I think you can,
on the page anyway. It says, in this process, the animal becomes an active participant in shaping the piece. So can you tell me more about that? Because I'm very curious on how you envision animals becoming active participants in the music, especially when they're imaginary animals.
Well, it's all about character agency, which, I mean, I've spoken a lot about it, but then the more I think about it, I realize that this character agency that writers talk about so much, you know, like when you create a character so well that then you cannot just decide whatever you want in the story to, or like you cannot decide whatever you want them to do or to think. they guide the
They have a
story
life
a
of their
lot.
own.
Yeah, and
Right.
if you don't respect this, then that's to the detriment of your of the story, right?
Right.
But then, I mean, that's absolutely what happens with these imaginary animals that I create, based on the sounds that I record of the instrumentalists, and then like what I imagine with them. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that our, I don't want to talk about other people's minds. My mind is full of this fauna. You know, it's even ways in which I think of myself, or parts of myself, or part of my personal story or collective memory. All of these have some sort of character agency. So when I'm working with an animal that I'm imagining that has this agency, it's not that different from when I just compose normally. Because when I'm composing, I'm thinking about the music from all of these perspectives that have their own agency in my mind.
Right.
Sounds a little bit schizoid maybe, but actually I think it's just maybe one way of understanding how many discourses and ideas and voices are like they make up our self-view in a way. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that maybe that's why it wasn't hard for me at all to respect this the agency of these animals. I mean, it was hard to do it sometimes because there's things that I would never have done musically speaking in these pieces. Some of them I don't like them, period. And some of them I do like them, but I find things difficult to listen to or hard, or I just really wish this was shorter, or you know, really wish this was maybe longer. But apart from that, it was very easy actually.
Okay, interesting. Well, let's take a listen, and yeah, we can hear what that actually sounds like.
Yes, it would be Vesterio 5.
Yes, that's
okay.
right.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. So I'm really enjoying understanding your process, and you've talked a little bit about the relationship with the performers, and with that last piece and this album, there's obviously a lot of relationship with the performers who've received instructions and so on. But one of the questions I really love to ask artists is, how important is it is it you? Is it for you that your audience understands that kind of depth of connection? Because when I'm performing, when I talk to other artists, we can think about sort of one end of the spectrum is it's basically like a lecture, and it's very obvious, like this is what the music means, and oftentimes that's not really aesthetically interesting. And at the other end of the spectrum, it's so esoteric, so conceptual, the audience has no idea kind of what's going on. And of course, there's everything in the middle there. So I'm curious about your thoughts on communicating those different types of relationships, or is it more about embodying those relationships in a different kind of aesthetic experience, or is it more about, you mentioned this kind of psychological exploration. I'm curious how you think about, or how you would like your audience to experience, engage, connect with your work, either recorded or live.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think I have like different answers, or like maybe different levels of that answer. For that answer, the first answer would be that a lot of these aspects of my piece that I find very important and interesting, they apply mostly to me. You know, like these psychological exercises, I don't expect other people to experience them. I do love it when the performer gets so involved in them that actually also they experience something at least similar, and then there's also kind of like a transformation after that. But there's like a very personal, and we could maybe call it spiritual part of that. That is, okay, I do this because I want to do this. And nevertheless, I do care about these things, and about the meaning, and about the conversations that it can spark. So if we can talk about it like the way that we're talking about it right now, or in other cases, or with writing, or I find that very important and beautiful. But then, at the end of the day, I also, at least most of the pieces, I really like them. And I like
the pieces themselves.
Exactly, I like how they exist. Yeah, I even like when I don't like them, if that makes sense. Because they're the result of something that I found really interesting. So I think that they can also have a life of their own, and even if people don't know anything about it. I mean, that's been my experience in general, because a lot of people don't read program notes, or they have no clue who I am, most of the world. So when they listen to a piece of mine and then they speak to me, I do tend to encounter these associations with it, about like there's an organic element to them, and how they experience it, or like sometimes
literally an organic element.
Exactly, yeah. And I really like it. But even if they have a completely different experience, I'm also super interested in that, right? Like at the end, I think most of us as musicians, we just want to put things out to see how they bounce around in the world, and what comes back to us, and we just hope it's a nice thing. But you know, it's a way of exploring the world. So I'm also interested in that.
So as usual, we close the episode with a recording of a live performance. And today we have the treat of hearing two live-ish performances. So maybe you can introduce these pieces and set them up for us. And yeah, what are we going to hear? There's two that you suggested that we listen to.
Yeah, absolutely. The first one is called En esta línea contengo un bosque, which translates into in this line I contain a forest, which is a full poem actually by Puerto Rican poet Eddie Ortiz González. And that's a string quartet. The second piece is Bestiario 6, so the sixth piece of the Bestiario series, which is for viola and that's not true. It is for soprano, clarinet, flute, and percussion.
And that's part of the series with the imaginary animals.
That's correct.
Really?
Yeah, it's the sixth piece. I got confused because I composed I finished the sixth piece before the fifth one. So the pieces, well, I already talked about the Bestiario cycle a little bit, so I'm going to talk a little about the other one. The other one it's actually something really nice that happened to me that doesn't happen to me often, but sometimes I have the pleasure. And what happened is I read that poem from Eddie Ortiz González's book, and I knew that the kind of piece that I wanted to write with that title. I didn't know a lot of the details, but I knew how it was going to start, how it was going to continue, how it was going to end.
Right.
And it's just, it was like a very powerful. I mentioned like I love how literature can evoke sounds. Well, that one evoked a whole piece.
Okay. Wow. From just the first reading of the poem.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I love that that's also the full poem. It's just that line.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Okay.
And yeah, you're gonna hear my idea of like what I imagined after reading that poem.
Great. Excellent. Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed that conversation.
Thank you.
And be sure to check out the show notes for links to Luis Fernando's work. The recordings we heard today will also include the link to some of the poets you mentioned and some of the pieces that I was going to say that your work is based on, but I think maybe inspired by is a more accurate way to put that. So yeah, check out that and also check out more about Sustain.fm with upcoming live events and workshops and of course Sustain.fm radio every month. So thank you very much for
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. Okay, thanks for listening to Sustain. Hope to catch you again next time. Be sure to sign up for our email list on our website, sustain.fm. Follow our Instagram, also sustain.fm, to get more info on the radio show, in-person events in different cities, live streams, and more. All right, until next time, see you on the dance floor.